You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us.
Hi, I'm Annie from the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. The podcast hosted by two women living on different continents who never met in real life and bonded over their mutual interest of murder, mystery, and the macabre throughout history.
Yep, that's right. That's us. Before we start, we would like to give a huge shout out to our newest Patreon patron, Katie Peterson. Thank you so much.
Hey!
Speaking of Patreon, to all of our murder tier patrons, you will already find 3 episodes of Cinema Macabre online in our feed. That's where we're going to be discussing and reviewing and sort of taking you through different true crime shows and documentaries. We started with the TV show Candy, and each episode is dedicated to a single episode of the show. Also, if you have any requests for shows you want us to watch next and talk about, send us a message or please just leave us a comment. We're trying to give you an episode a week for Patron. And yeah, I think we're almost halfway through Candy, so We definitely need your suggestions.
We are more than halfway through. I think there are 5 episodes.
That's right. We are more than halfway. So tell us what to do next, or we'll just pick something that we like.
Also, if you're not a patron but still want to have early access to our episodes and a little bit of bonus material like rewatch videos of our live streams, you can now join our bonus program on Spotify and iTunes. No worries, our podcast and all the episodes will always stay free for everyone. It's just for the people who have messaged us and asked us how they can get extra stuff and support the podcast without joining Patreon.
That's right. So we're trying to figure out what the options are, and we appreciate you. So, all right, now let's get into today's episode. It is the second and final part about some of the lives of those quote-unquote freak show performers. If we wanted to, we could spend years telling stories of the people who lived and worked in these sideshows, freak shows, human exhibitions. There are hundreds, probably thousands of names that have been lost to time. People who were put on display, exploited, celebrated, ridiculed, or in some cases managed to take control of their own fates. Some lived really tragic lives, others found fame and fortune. But no matter how their stories ended, they all started the same way, with the world looking at them as though they were curiosities, not people, not humans. And of course, we can't tell every story. That would be, you could have a podcast just talking about this. It would be fascinating. But we're not going to do that. And so in these 2 episodes, this is the second, we've chosen a few that really represent the many fates of freak show performers. Their lives were extraordinary, but not because of their appearances, more because of what they endured and what they made of the hand they were dealt. They kept going, right?
If you've ever seen the 1932 film Freaks, then you've seen the next performer we're going to be talking about, Schlitzie. In the annals of sideshow history, few figures are as ironic or as tragic as Schlitzie. With his very distinctive appearance and childlike demeanor, he became a symbol of the era's fascination with human oddities. But his life was marked by exploitation, interrupted by brief and rare moments of kindness. Schlitzie's origins are somewhat up for debate. The official record suggests that he was born on 10th of September 1901 in the Bronx, in New York. However, some accounts claim he was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Equally up for debate is his birth name. While he was legally known in later days as Schlitzie Surtees, some believe he was born as Simon Metz. Unfortunately, due to his early introduction into the sideshow circuit and the informal nature of his guardianships, definite details about his early life have been lost over time. What is known is that Schlitzie was born with microcephaly, a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by an abnormally small brain and skull.
To explain a little bit further, microcephaly is a rare neurological condition where a person's head is significantly smaller than expected for their age. This happens because the brain doesn't develop properly during pregnancy or stops growing early in life. It can range from mild to severe in nature, and some people with microcephaly have only very slightly smaller heads, no intellectual difficulties or disabilities, while others, like Schlitzie, are born with significant cognitive impairment and will require lifelong care. Most cases of microcephaly are congenital, meaning that they are present at birth. It can be caused by genetic mutations and infections during pregnancy. This was very, very popular in the last decade because, of course, of the Zika virus. And so this is one of the reasons that Zika is so very dangerous for pregnant women. It can also be caused by severe malnutrition, exposure to harmful substances, or complications during fetal development. One of the most distinct features of severe microcephaly is that the brain's growth is limited, which of course affects overall development. So people with microcephaly may experience delayed speech and fine motor skills, and they may also have intellectual disabilities, seizures, difficulty with coordination and balance, and a shorter than average stature.
Schlitzie was no exception. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, people with microcephaly were often exhibited in sideshows because of their smaller heads and their very distinctive facial features. And many were marketed, and we hear that over and over again, that term, as missing links between humans and apes, or again, as members of undiscovered primitive tribes. All of which was, of course, complete pseudoscience. Other names they were given were things like the last of the Aztecs, as I said, the missing links, the wild man of Borneo, or the monkey girl. Or, and you might have come across this term already, pinhead. It was a cruel and now, thank God, outdated term used to describe people with microcephaly. And why pinhead? Well, the term comes from the distinctive head shape seen in some cases of severe microcephaly, where the skull kind of tapers upwards to a narrower point, almost like the shape of a sewing pin. It's obviously an offensive and medically inaccurate term, but in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it became a popular freak show label because freak show owners and circus managers weren't exactly interested in medical accuracy. They lived for the shock and the sensationalism. Performers like Schlitzie or last week's Julia Pastrana were never from lost civilizations. They were never missing links. They were real people with medical conditions who were dressed up and forced into roles that freak show owners knew would sell more tickets. Today, of course, we know that conditions like microcephaly is just that, a medical condition, and people born with it deserve care, dignity, and respect, and not to be treated as entertainment. But back then, the pinhead label stuck, and performers with microcephaly became some of the most recognizable figures in sideshow history. And Schlitzie was one of them. Standing at just 4 feet tall, he also experienced myopia or nearsightedness and had the mental intellectual capacity of a 3-year-old. And despite all these challenges, those who knew him described Schlitzie as an affectionate, exuberant individual who loved dancing and singing and who loved being the center of attention. To enhance his mystique, he was often dressed in a muumuu and presented as a female or androgynous, and this choice was also partly practical, as Schlitzie was incontinent and required the use of diapers and making dresses just way more convenient for his care. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Schlitzie was a prominent attraction in major circuses, including, of course, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, the Clyde Beatty Circus, or the Tom Mix Circus. His film debut came in 1928 with The Sideshow, which is a drama set in circus environment. However, it was his role in Todd Browning's 1932 film Freaks that cemented his place in popular culture. The film became famous also for the fact that it featured quote-unquote real freaks, so real sideshow performers. And it was so controversial upon release that it was banned in the UK for over 30 years. Today it's considered a cult classic, with Schlitzie's performance being particularly memorable. Did you ever watch the movie, Annie?
I have never seen it. Should I?
You should watch it.
I feel like I should.
Yeah. For those of you who also don't know the movie, just like Annie, so Freaks is a horror film that takes place in a traveling circus where the freaks form a very tight-knit community, and the plot follows Hans, who is a little person who falls in love with a very beautiful but very cruel trapeze artist, Cleopatra. Cleopatra starts a relationship with Hans, and she's, however, only after Hans's inheritance, and she secretly plots to marry him and then poison him for his money. And the film's most famous moment, the wedding feast, is when the freaks welcome Cleopatra into their family with a chant that became somewhat legendary. "We accept her, one of us. Gooble, gobble, one of us." It's also the quote that gets used very often in our Facebook group.
I know the quote.
New members join.
Yep.
Cleopatra, however, she's disgusted. She humiliates them, making it very clear she has nothing but contempt for them. And I won't spoil the plot any further. Go watch it. It's definitely a cult classic for a reason.
Yeah, I will.
In 1935, while performing with the Tom Mix Circus, Schlitzie was adopted by George Saddest. He was a chimpanzee trainer, and Saddest became his legal guardian, providing a kind of semblance of stability in this tumultuous life, chaotic life. Schlitzie continued to perform in sideshows under Saddest's care. However, after Saddest's death in 1965, his daughter, who was very unfamiliar with the carnival world, committed Schlitzie to a Los Angeles County hospital. And during his hospitalization, Schlitzie's health started to decline. He missed the carnival life deeply. He became depressed because he was away from the public eye. Fortunately, Bill Frenchie Angst, who was a sword swallower, worked at the hospital during off-seasons, and he recognized Schlitzie. And he understood Schlitzie's need for social interaction and performance, and Angst arranged for Schlitzie to be released into the care of a showman named Sam Alexander. So Schlitzie returned to the sideshow circuit, performing until 1968. And in his later years, Schlitzie resided in Los Angeles, occasionally performing both locally and internationally, and he became a very familiar figure on the streets of Hollywood with caretakers selling his souvenir pictures. He often visited MacArthur Park, and he was delighting in feeding the pigeons and ducks, and he also loved to entertain passerbys. On 24th of September 1971, Schlitzie passed away at the age of 70 at the Fountain View Convalescent Home, and he was interred at Queen of Haven Cemetery in Rowland Heights, California. Personally, I think Schlitzie's story is really interesting because we talked excessively about the exploitation and the cruelty, the way performers were often treated as less than human. And all of this is, of course, absolutely true. But then here's Schlitzie, and the surprising thing is he loved to perform, or at least he seemed to. It looks as if he thrived in the world of sideshows, and he loved crowds, he loved the applause, the attention, and he was, according to everything people who knew him said, happiest when he was performing, laughing, and engaging with people.
That's why the moment he was institutionalized in 1965 was so difficult and just heartbreaking for him. It's like he lost his purpose, his will to live. He had no constant movement and excitement of circus life. He would have been so isolated in that hospital compared to what his life had been previously. And of course, he didn't understand why he'd been locked away and why he wasn't, allowed to perform.
Yeah. I think for most people, or what we imagine, what most people would feel when they are removed from a freak show, that would have meant freedom, right? But Schlitzie, for him, it meant losing the only world he had ever known and the world he belonged, or where he felt he belonged. So when we say he missed a freak show, it's not that he missed being exploited. I think he missed being seen, like really seen.
Yeah.
By the way, if you're interested in reading more about Schlitzie and are also into graphic novels, in 2019, Bill Griffith published a book called Nobody's Fool about the life of Schlitzie Surti.
Yeah. I think, this story is such an interesting one, I think, because ideally, you wish that he was born into a family that just loved him and took care of him for the rest of his life, right? And none of this was an issue. But as we say, it was a different time. And so you do feel like it's like the best possible situation of a terrible situation, the best possible, worst possible
outcome,
thing.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I know what you mean.
Like if this person who will forever be a 3-year-old, like I think all of us can remember, that 3 to 5-year-old age with nieces and nephews or friends' kids or whatever. I just keep picturing that age where watch me perform, watch me, do you know? And life is so simple. It's important to not, it's hard to find the right words. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean. I also have the feeling from things I read and clips I saw from the movies that he was this kind of person in his world, in his mind. When people were laughing at him, I don't even think he felt like they were laughing at him, but laughing with him.
With him. That's right. He would never have understood it. I mean, with all the special needs that come with being a forever 3-year-old, I feel like it's a blessing that he ended up finding a life that was full of so much joy. And we can see that he was being exploited, but I think it matters that he would never have, unlike many of the other people we talk about, I think that for him, being in the institution was hell, and being involved in the circus, that was life.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
All right. Next up, we have the Two-Headed Nightingale. This is the story of the conjoined twins Millie Christine and Christine Millie McKoy. Their story is even a little bit more complex than those of other exploited performers because they weren't just forced into display in a curiosity show, they were born into slavery. Millie and Christine McKoy were born conjoined in 1851 in Whiteville, North Carolina. To be exact, they were pygopagus conjoined twins, meaning they were joined at the lower spine and stood at approximately a 90-degree angle to each other. Despite their unique physical condition, they each had 2 arms and 2 legs and were otherwise healthy. If you're trying to picture this in photographs, it looks like they are 2 well-dressed women standing upright, kind of shoulder to shoulder and slightly back to back, not unlike the way friends pose today.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how else to, hopefully that explains. Their parents were Jacob and Monimia McKoy, who had 7 other children before the twins were born. They were an enslaved couple owned by a blacksmith named Jabez McKay, which meant that when their daughters were born, they weren't seen as a medical curiosity, they were also property. And here's where things get really horrifying. When the twins were just 10 months old, they were taken from their parents and sold to a man named John C. Purvis because apparently a 2-for-1 deal on baby humans was too good to pass up. Purvis immediately put them on display, renting them out to fairs to turn a profit. But he wasn't the last to cash in on them. Yet less than 2 years later, the twins were sold again, this time to a showman named Brower. And he wasted no time putting the McKoy twins on display at North Carolina's first ever state fair in 1853, billing them as a freak of nature. And just like that, before they could even talk, Millie and Christine were being exhibited for paying audiences. And if all of that wasn't disturbing enough already, get this, when the twins were 4 years old, they were actually kidnapped. By now, we understand that freak show performers mean big money. It wasn't just P.T. Barnum who made a fortune displaying people to a paying audience. If someone saw an opportunity to steal a profitable attraction, they did. In this case, a man from Texas promised Brower $45,000 for the twins, an absolutely outrageously huge sum of money at the time. If the historical inflation calculator is correct, we're talking about roughly $1.6 million US. Brower couldn't possibly pass up such a lucrative offer, but instead of paying, the Texan took the money and ran with the kids. They were smuggled to the north, then shipped off to Canada, where they were rebranded under a new name and exhibited by yet another group of showmen.
I think he even took them to Europe. I think that's where they were ultimately found. Europe.
Meanwhile, their original owners, yes, plural, it was not just Brower, but also Brower had an investor who thought they had a right to get their property back. And so they were trying to track them down. Millie and Christina were bought and sold several times before they were finally found by Brower's investor and reclaimed. He got custody of the girls in 1857 and brought their mother, Monimia, to live with them. And just like that, they were reunited as a family for the first time since infancy. Don't have good thoughts about any of this, though. It's like,
No.
it's like, no.
No.
By the time the Civil War broke out, Millie and Christine were still being exhibited. By the way, to prove to the audience that they were really conjoined twins, they were often forced to appear on stage in a state that was quoted as, quote, without any infringement of modesty, end quote. So basically, you're paying to see naked children on stage. You can imagine the sort of people that would attract. And here's where the story takes a turn, because in 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people in the Confederate States, including them. So technically, they were free. But the big question was, free to do what? They had been raised in show business, they had been exhibited literally since infancy, and rather than retreat from the world, they took control of what had been forced on them. And now, instead of being billed as medical anomalies, Millie and Christine leaned into their talent, which was music. They had beautiful singing voices, could play multiple instruments, and spoke French, English, and German. So they rebranded themselves the Two-Headed Nightingale, focusing on music and entertainment instead of being examined as medical oddities. And it worked. They became incredibly successful, performing for massive crowds, including Queen Victoria herself, who was reportedly deeply impressed with them. They also performed with P.T. Barnum's circus, singing in harmony, Millie as alto and Christine as soprano. The Buffalo Weekly Express, Thursday, November 3rd, 1887, page 5. Quote, a female doubleheader. The reporter hears both sides of her story, matrimonial hindrances. From the Chicago Tribune. The double-headed girl, Millie Christine and Christine Millie, is now holding receptions afternoon and evening at one of the dime museums of the city. A Tribune reporter sent to interview her or them found her or them singing pleasantly to a mixed audience, and after the singing was done, found them or her quite ready to talk and quite capable of talking intelligently. She or they, it's two people. She or they was or were born in She or they was or were born in North Carolina in 1853, and the parents were a couple of unassuming colored people named McKoy. From childhood, the double-headed girl has been on the platform and seems to like it. The right-hand head is Millie Christine, to whom also All right, follow this one. The right-hand head is Millie Christine, to whom also appertains the right-hand feet. The left-hand head and feet are Christine Millie. The middle of the body is either and both. This you got to pay the author of this the compliment of at least trying to get all these pronouns sorted. How do you like Chicago? Was the question asked of the right-hand head. Oh, I've been here before. I like it very much. Did your sister accompany you on your former visit? Go away. Like, what the fuck, dude? Did you think the sister didn't accompany her? Have you the same tastes in food? Hardly, said the starboard head. Scarcely, said the larboard head? That's not a thing. Okay. How do you get along, then, in the selection of food? We don't get along, said the starboard head indignantly. Christine Millie is so reckless she knows that cheese and macaroni always disagree with me, but she ate a great plate full of it yesterday at the hotel. It was cruel. I had to eat 4 apples for dessert to get even with her. Ah, but didn't I give her a stomachache? Don't talk of my cruelty, retorted the larboard head. I don't think is larboard a word? Don't talk of my cruelty, retorted the larboard head. Who was it drank a glass of beer one night last week and gave me a headache next morning? You know I detest beer. That's why I ate the macaroni and cheese. I don't care, said the starboard head. I'm going to eat more apples. If you do, was the vigorous rejoinder, I'll eat every pickle on the table if it kills me. It seemed a delicate piece of thoughtfulness to the visitor to change the subject of conversation at this juncture, and the double heads were asked jointly if they'd ever had a lover. The audacity, honestly. Can you imagine asking someone if they'd ever had a lover?
Unbelievable.
A look of pain passed over each face, and even the agent looked troubled. It was evident that the inquirer had unconsciously touched upon a delicate subject. Unconsciously, my ass, please. There was silence a few moments, and then the larboard head spoke tremblingly. "We seldom talk about that," she said. "It is a theme we have agreed between our heads to avoid as much as possible. Since the question has been asked, though, it may as well be answered. We have been loved. The first occasion was 13 years ago when a respectable young colored man in Detroit declared his affection. Christine Millie reciprocated his feelings, but I could not. I tried my best to care for him, since he was really a nice young man, but it was useless. I told him finally that his suit must be without avail. I said I could love him as a brother, and that was all. Of course, we couldn't get married on affection. That was half sisterly, half wifely, and so he finally abandoned the effort." End quote. These sisters are some bitches, huh?
Yeah, but I love how they fight with each other, just like siblings do.
Constantly. Like Chang and Aang seemed like best friends that were joined forever. And these two is like that sister that you love but can't stand, and you're stuck together forever.
Or they were putting on a show for the reporters. That's
True.
also possible.
But I feel really bad because it sounds like her sister wanted to marry this guy, and she was like, no. After decades of performing, Millie and Christine had made a fortune, enough that they could afford to buy the North Carolina plantation where they had been born as slaves. So think about that for a second. They were born as property, sold multiple times, displayed for profit their entire lives, and in the end, they owned the land that they had once been forced to leave. That's really one hell of a full circle moment. By 1912, they were finally ready to retire from show business. After nearly 6 decades of being in the public eye, they returned home and lived a quiet life. But on October 8, 1912, Millie contracted tuberculosis and passed away. Christine, who had literally never lived a moment without her sister, followed her just 12 hours later. They were originally buried in an unmarked grave, but in 1969 their remains were moved to a cemetery in Whiteville, where a proper tombstone was finally placed, reading, "A soul with 2 thoughts, 2 hearts that beat as one." End quote.
I like it.
It's a pretty remarkable story.
Now I have to think about the same with Chang and Aang. Imagine you're watching not only your sibling, but your conjoined twin die.
Mm-hmm. And then you're just waiting for your own death.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Very. All right, the next one is one of those stories, again, that manages to be equal part infuriating, horrifying, but also unfortunately fascinating in a way. I'm talking about Krao Farini, who's another child who was taken from her home, this time from her home in Southeast Asia, and shipped across the world and paraded as living proof, again, once more, that humans evolved from apes.
Yeah, this one's bad. This is going to make you mad.
I don't even know where to begin, to be honest.
Yeah.
Let's start in 1876 in Laos, when a baby girl was born with hypertrichosis. We talked about it last week, a condition that causes excessive hair growth over the body. In Julia Pastrana's case, you remember the so-called bear woman. You might think Julia and Krao had the same condition, but they really didn't. So Krao had generalized hypertrichosis, which just meant that she had thick hair covering her entire body, but her facial structure was completely normal. Julia, on the other hand, had hypertrichosis terminalis, plus a condition called gingival hyperplasia, which gave her the enlarged jaw and the thick lips and the very unusual facial proportions. So Krao was born looking different than all the other kids in her community, but from all we know, to the people in her community, she was just a kid who had more hair on her body, but a little girl. But across the world, Victorian-era scientists and showmen were desperate for proof of evolution. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species had shaken Western society, and people were absolutely obsessed with the idea of finding the missing link between humans and apes. Enter Carl Bock, a Norwegian explorer, and Dr. George Shelley, an anthropologist who, spoiler alert, was not interested in doing actual science. The two of them show up in Southeast Asia in 1881, claiming to be on a scientific expedition. But it looks as if they were more on the hunt for something freakish to bring back to Europe. And they found it in Krao. Some sources say Krao was kidnapped, others claim her parents were paid off. Either way, a 7-year-old girl was taken from her home and shipped off to be a live exhibit in Western science fairs and freak shows. By 1883, Krao was being exhibited in London, and the marketing around her was absolutely insane. Once more, posters described her as, quote, the perfect specimen of the Darwinian theory of evolution, or a living proof of the natural transition from ape to man, or the missing link between humanity and the lower animal kingdom, end quote. And if you think actual scientists pushed back against this, yeah, no, they didn't. And the Victorian public, well, they ate it up. Pseudoscience was in its golden age, and people were desperate to believe in scientific discoveries that confirmed their worldview. Newspapers printed headlines about the half-woman, half-monkey girl, and even the so-called intellectuals were using Krao's appearance to push their own agendas. Mainly that some people were just simply less evolved than others. Because, of course, there was also a deeply racist element to all of this. Europeans had long used twisted interpretations of evolution to justify their colonial rule of non-Western countries. The Victorian elite weren't just staring at Krao because of her appearance, they were using her as a proof that non-white people were just kind of biologically inferior to them. And Krao, well, she was 7 years old and had absolutely no say in this, no voice, no agency over her own life. And after being paraded through London's scientific halls, Krao was sold into the sideshow industry, because, of course, she was. Her new manager was a man named William Leonard Hunt, better known as the Great Farini, one of the biggest names in the freak show business. If you remember our P.T. Barnum episodes, you'll recognize the pattern. Find a person with an unusual appearance, completely invent a backstory, and sell it to the public as truth. And the Great Farini, that name has a certain ring to it.
Yeah. All these, like the great whoever. It's like the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Also, you know, I keep thinking, I don't know if you have this too, but I keep going back and forth between wondering how much pseudoscience was blatant a money grab and they knew it was nonsense, and how much pseudoscience was just they just had no idea what was going on. Like, I keep thinking about the shark attacks in 1916 where they thought it was a sea turtle and that the shark bites were venomous. It's wild.
It's very blurry.
Yeah.
But don't you also sometimes think, what will people say 100 years from now, what we believe is completely firm science, and 100 years from now they're going to realize, what the fuck were these people thinking?
Yeah, totally.
The Great Farini. Let me tell you, this guy was something else. So his name, as I said, was William Leonard Hunt, and he was born in 1838 in New York, though he grew up in Canada. And from a young age, he was obsessed with danger and performance. By the time he was 21, he had reinvented himself as Signor Farini, because of course a fake Italian name sounded way more exciting than Mr. Hunt. His first big stunt, tightrope walking over a river in Ontario, where he didn't just cross, he did somersaults and handstands, and he walked blindfolded because apparently just surviving wasn't dramatic enough. But Farini wasn't satisfied with his small-town fame, so in 1860 he set his sights on Niagara Falls, where he got into a full-on tightrope rivalry with the legendary Charles Blondin. Blondin had already made headlines for walking across the falls, so Farini had to one-up him. He carried a man on his back, hung upside down, and even wore a sack over his head just to prove he was the bigger daredevil. And for a while it worked. He became one of the biggest names in high-wire stunts. But then in 1862, tragedy struck. During a performance in Havana, so in Cuba, he attempted a dangerous act with his wife. carrying her across a tightrope on his shoulders. She slipped and fell, and though she survived the fall, she died a few days later from her injuries. After that, Farini pivoted from daredevil to full-time showman. He started scouting for unique performers, managing acts, and rebranding himself as an explorer. And in 1883, he launched his most infamous discovery yet, when he introduced the world to a young girl from Southeast Asia named Krao. By the way, if you want to know more about the Great Farini, there's a biography titled The Great Farini, The High Wire Life of William Hunt by Shane Peacock that's absolutely worth a read. Farini claimed that Krao came from a primitive tree-dwelling tribe, a complete fabrication of course, and he dressed her in skins and beads and fake tribal accessories, or what he imagined as tribal accessories. He even hired actors to pose as her family at exhibits, and of course, because regular old exploitation wasn't enough, Farini and his crew had to sprinkle in some good old-fashioned pseudoscience to really sell Krao as the missing link. Reports from 1883 and 1884 made all sorts of absolutely wild claims about her anatomy, most of which were either grossly exaggerated, deliberately misleading, or just outright fake. Some of the so-called scientific observations that she had cheek pouches like a monkey for storing food, which of course she didn't, that she had ape-like ears and a flat nose with no cartilage, a tiny skull with a wild expression and bushy eyebrows. And because why not? Let's just claim she has a 13th rib, which was of course another total fabrication. And despite all of this, Krao wasn't just an uneducated sideshow act. She spoke multiple languages, including English, German, and Thai. She knew exactly how fake her own backstory was, but she just played along, to survive, to get money. She adapted to Western culture incredibly fast and even performed in vaudeville-style shows as she got older. And by the early 1900s, she was one of the most famous freak show performers in the world. And of course, she too became one of the stars of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus. And here's where Krao's story gets even more interesting. Unlike some of the other freak show performers, Krao didn't seem to hate the industry, much like Schlitzie apparently. Now, let's be clear, she was absolutely exploited. She was stolen from her homeland, from her family as a child. She was forced to be a scientific exhibit and then turned into a sideshow act. But as she got older, she made the best of it.
Yeah, she kept going. That's what we always say, isn't it? Just like the buffalo in winter who will walk into the storm, right? Bison, American buffalo do that. When there's a terrible storm, they walk into it because they understand that the fastest way to get out of the weather is to walk straight into it to get to the other side, right? And that's what we mean when we say keep going.
Yeah. In her later years, Krao established a permanent residence in Brooklyn at 309 East 19th Street, and she lived in an apartment within a building that was owned by her close friends, a German couple named Mr. and Mrs. Jakob Zeiler. And this arrangement provided her with a stable living environment and a very supportive social circle. Krao was known to wear a veil in public to maintain her privacy and to avoid unwanted attention. Beyond her performances, Krao had a very rich personal life. She was an avid violin player, playing by ear in a style that was more folk than classical. In a 1903 interview, she expressed her love for music, stating, quote, "Music makes me happy here," end quote, while gesturing to her heart. On top of that, she also enjoyed crocheting and was fond of books. She had a lifelong love of learning new things, and these hobbies not only provided her with personal fulfillment, but also helped her build connections with those around her. As I said, she had a very rich social circle. For example, she maintained a very close friendship with a fellow bearded lady named Grace Gilbert until Grace's death in 1924. It's not that Krao chose this life. It's that she didn't really have another option and that she did what she could to make it work for her. She continued performing in New York City's dime museums and at Coney Island until her death in 1926 at the age of 49 from influenza. This is from the Brooklyn Eagle from Monday, April 19th, 1926, from page 19. Quote, "Circus pals weep as Krao is buried. Missing link's body taken to grave in Astoria. While sideshow freaks wept, the body of Krao Farini, missing link woman from Siam, who appeared with the Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers Circus for 30 years, was carried from Jacob Herrlich and Sons undertaking establishment on 332 East 86th Street, Manhattan yesterday afternoon for burial in St. Michael's Cemetery, Astoria. The Reverend Augustus Steimel spoke of the spiritual qualities of Krao, who was a master of several languages. Several of her associates in the sideshow paid glowing tributes to the queer little bearded woman as the peacemaker of the sideshow. Krao died on Friday. Krao was said to have come from the jungles of Siam. She started her career in a dime museum in Philadelphia back in the 80s. Before that, she had been a protege of Farini, an English circus promoter whose name she eventually adopted. End quote. I'm glad that they called her a missing link in that article, but they talked a little bit more about her. I think that's nice, at least.
Yes, some people give her some of her humanity. That's right. Yeah. Glad that we've been able to share some of the true lives of these remarkable people. We thought about talking about Joseph Merrick in this episode, who you might know as the Elephant Man, but there's so much information on him. He is probably his own case, potentially, for a different episode in the future. So in case you're wondering, how are you going to do a human oddity show and not talk about him? So instead, we're going to tell you about a lesser-known story, which is deeply disturbing, and it's the story of Myrtle Corbin. And she is a woman who was born differently, lived differently, still managed to prove everyone wrong. All right, so we know, of course, about the exploitation and mistreatment with these people being used for profit, but Myrtle's story is a little bit different. She was a sideshow performer, but also a medical marvel and a mother, and a woman who lived her life the way she wanted to. And because this wouldn't be a Fresh Hell episode without something really disturbing, her body was also nearly stolen by grave robbers. So buckle up. This whole thing is just terrible. Okay. Josephine Myrtle Corbin was born in 1868 in Lincoln County, Tennessee, with a condition called dipygus. Dipygus. Now, if it sounds vaguely terrifying, it's because it kind of is. Dipygus is a severe congenital deformity, meaning you're born with it. It's funny, we keep talking about congenital deformities as opposed to the deformities where you suddenly grow new legs. Like, aren't they all? I guess they're not.
I think they mean the ones that are caused, for example, by disease or accidents later in life, right? It happens too. Yeah.
Yeah, she was born with these extra body parts, which is way better than suddenly waking up with them. I think we can all agree. All right. So, dipygus is a severe congenital deformity where the lower half of the body duplicates itself, meaning that she had 2 pelvises, 2 sets of legs, and 2 reproductive systems. You heard that correctly, 2 fully functioning pelvises. The legs were not fully formed. They're sort of smaller and lesser developed legs and weak, like they wouldn't hold her up, but they moved when she moved. And doctors, of course, were fascinated because Victorian medicine was essentially, let's poke it and see what happens. And then, depending on the results, we're either going to give you cocaine or heroin for it and have a good night. Maybe a combination of the two. Myrtle, she was fine. She was healthy, she was active, and totally normal apart from the extra legs.
And I think also looking at pictures, and given at the time women were wearing long skirts and long dresses, it's also something that you could hide easily when going out, right?
Yes.
I'd say.
You could. So now let's talk about Myrtle's entrance into the freak show world. Unlike many performers of the time, Myrtle was not mistreated by her parents. By all accounts, her family loved her, and she grew up in a stable, supportive home. But here's the thing. People were staring. It was the late 1800s, and medicine was still one step removed from being witchcraft. So when news spread about a baby girl with 4 legs, people wanted to see her. And so her father made a very Victorian decision. He was like, yeah, that's fine. You can look at my daughter, but it's going to cost you. By the time Myrtle was 13, her father had arranged for her to appear in sideshows, not because he was cruel or greedy, but because freak shows were one of the few places where she could be successful and financially independent. Was it exploitation? Kind of. But it was also one of the only viable career options for someone born like her in the 19th century, you know? I think the thing I keep with the women especially, it's that weird thing where their options were so limited at that time anyhow.
Yeah.
Right? Like all women in the best possible scenario, you didn't have that many options. You know what I mean? And if you're thinking, you know, this could all go very badly with her starting to join freak shows, you know, you'd be right. But instead, Myrtle became one of the most famous stars of her time in the freak show circuit, and she made a damn good living off of it because people loved her. She was billed as the four-legged girl from Texas and quickly became a star. Unlike a lot of other freak show performers, Myrtle didn't have to act out an exaggerated persona. She was just herself, a sweet, intelligent, and very witty young girl who just happened to have twice the normal number of legs.
Yeah, I think a big difference was that she was not promoted as missing link between humans and...
That's right. She was never... Yeah, it was never suggested she wasn't a human. Like the other ones, it's like, oh, this thing's not really a human. This is something that we found wherever. Whereas she was treated like a person who just happened to have, I think, yeah. So she toured with P.T. Barnum, Ringling Brothers, many other big shows, and by her late teens, she was making good money. But like almost all of the other freak performers, Myrtle's condition wasn't just a visual curiosity, it was a medical phenomenon. And the doctors wanted to learn from her. Doctors discovered that both of her pelvises were functional, meaning she had 2 uteri, 2 vaginas, which also means, 2 periods. I wonder if they were at the same time. Do you think? Like,
oh my God, imagine they're not at the same time.
Right. That's what I'm, all the women listening are like imagining certain issues. But the Victorian doctors, they weren't really worried about any of that. They were just obsessed by her differences. She was examined by countless medical professionals, and all were shocked at how well she functioned. One physician noted that she was, quote, perfectly healthy and fully developed in every way, end quote.
It just gives me the creeps. It sounds so predatory because we are talking about a teenage girl.
Yeah, we don't love the idea of doctors, of all kinds of quote unquote doctors and physicians of that time.
Yeah, I mean,
examining...
I get it. Of course, she has to be examined, but it's so sensationalized again, so salacious in a way. You know what I mean?
Yep. It doesn't get any better. It's going to get worse. Here we go. So Myrtle, meanwhile, she's just out there living her life because what else is she supposed to do? In 1886, at the age of 18, Myrtle did something that nobody expected. She got married. Her husband, James Clinton Bicknell, was a doctor, and their marriage sent Victorian medical circles into a full-blown meltdown.
Rightfully so. Was he her doctor? Because this sounds extremely unethical and again, very creepy.
Yeah. Like, how did the relationship even start? I think we actually know. Oh, God. Yeah, sorry. Did he meet her as a patient, decide she was interesting, and then suddenly think, I should really lock that down and put a ring on it?
You know what it reminds me of?
What's that?
The movie Poor Little Things.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of that. Anybody who watched that movie, you're gonna know what I'm talking about. Ugh.
Yeah. Doctor-patient boundaries were not really a thing during Victorian medicine, but Myrtle had been medically examined her entire life. Men in lab coats had been poking and prodding and writing about her body and debating whether or not she could have sex or children. And, then one of them marries her. We have thoughts. From all we know, their marriage was by all accounts normal, at least as normal as Victorian marriages got, which, I mean, it's not a really high bar, is it? Doctors were convinced Myrtle would never have children because she was so medically unique, right? Surely pregnancy would be impossible, or at the very least, very dangerous. She had 5 children. That's right, 5 totally, completely healthy children. And the interesting thing is doctors couldn't agree on which uterus she got pregnant in, because again, she had 2. Some reports suggest that she alternated pregnancies between her 2 wombs, which, if true, makes her one of the rarest medical cases in history.
And then could she, in theory, could have been pregnant at the same time with 2 wombs?
Mm-hmm. In theory. Then, after years in the freak show industry, Myrtle retired and lived a normal life. Over the years, she had made enough money to be comfortable. She settled in Texas, focused on raising her children, and stepped away from the sideshow world completely. And her story could have ended there, a rare example of a freak show performer who actually had a happy ending. But no, we have to talk about the grave robbers. So Myrtle died in 1928 at the age of 60, and apparently people couldn't let her just rest in peace. Shortly after her death, medical institutions, collectors, and opportunists started trying to get their hands on her body. Why? Because people still wanted to exhibit her.
That's something that we read or read in their research over and over and over again. Bodies being sold or stolen to make even more profit off of these exploited people, and so many times also performers begging their families or their friends or their acquaintances to not let that happen. And so many times they were let down by their families and sold after their death, which is horrible.
Very upsetting. And Myrtle's family, they knew what was coming, so they took extreme precaution. They buried her in a reinforced steel coffin. The grave was covered in concrete to make exhumation nearly impossible, and the exact location of her grave was kept private. So, thanks to these extra layers of protection and precaution by her loved ones, Myrtle's body was never stolen. A rare case in which a freak show performer actually got to rest in peace, because not many got that luxury.
And that's it with Barnum and Victorian human curiosities, as I said, at least for now. Maybe one day we'll talk about Joseph Merrick, for example. But next week we'll be back with a historical murder, right, Annie?
Lots of historical murder. Many. Yeah, this is a wild story next week. Oh, yeah.
Do you have something good, something bad, something mid?
You know what? I feel like everything is bad right now. What's good? Do you have anything good? Have you seen any good movies recently? Or like...
No, I haven't seen a good movie, but you know what? I started watching Dexter Original Sin.
I haven't started it yet. How is it?
Surprisingly good. Seriously, I had no expectation. Dexter New Blood was kind of a letdown in my opinion, especially the last episodes, and we don't even have to talk about the final season of Dexter or the last 2 seasons of Dexter. But wow, the actors cast for young Dexter, young Debbie and so on are amazing. Amazing. And so far it's really a fun watch. So I can recommend it. I'm not, taking responsibility if they gonna screw this one up again in the end, but so far it's been very entertaining. Let's say it like this.
Nice. It's on my list. I haven't started to watch that one yet, and I need to. Did you hear my big opus in the background there? I have 2 shows that I've been really enjoying, and I don't think I've mentioned them on here. They are not murdery. They are, one is called Maine Cabin Masters, and it's this group of people that just go around and fix up these little cabins on lakes and in the woods all around Maine. I'm so impressed. I love watching. The other one is The Repair Shop, which is on, I think Maine Cabin Masters is maybe on Peacock or Hulu. It's on something. I can't think what. Netflix maybe. And The Repair Shop is on Prime with BritBox, and that one is this giant barn in England where people bring things that need repair. So like, this is a 300-year-old bureau that my great aunt had, and someone broke into the house and tried to, they damaged it trying to get it open. Can you repair it? And they do. I love these shows. I'm so impressed by people who have the skill and the ability to like be handy, to build things with their own hands, to build buildings, like people in construction, people that do all that stuff. And then these craftsmen in that other show, I am so clumsy and unwieldy. Like I should never be on a ladder. No one should ever give me power tools. And I wish I'm not joking when I like sincerely wish I had that ability. You know what I mean? I'm so impressed by people who can come build something. It's so far beyond. Been really enjoying Main Cabin Masters and The Repair Shop, both suggested by my friend Misty for like good. Yeah, Main Cabin Masters, they also have dogs. So their dogs are always with them. And yeah, so they show up to the cabin and they've all got their dogs on tow and the dogs are like swimming in the lake all day. And it's just the best. It's like TV equalizers for your brain lately.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in Patreon, don't forget to tell us what we should discuss next time. We'll see. We'll think about it.
If you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes, please also do us the huge favor. Jem is barking in the background. Do us the huge favor to go to your podcast app that you use and leave us a rating and or review. You really have no idea how much it means to us. We got a couple of really lovely messages and comments about the Barnum episodes, which really made me tear up because all the while we were doing these episodes, I was like, because it was the topic I picked and I told Annie, I'm worried that everybody's going to find it so boring and absolutely not interesting. And when we get this feedback from people who say they really like the episodes, then that really means a lot to us. So, yeah.
I told you, I was like, I find it interesting. And if I find it interesting, then I'm sure other people are going to find it interesting. And if you don't, you know what? You've got so many more episodes of ours to choose from.
And
we'll be back next week with terrible murder.
Yeah. Check out our Patreon.
Oh, like and subscribe on YouTube.
Yes.
Shout out to all the YouTube listeners. Please like and subscribe on YouTube.
And if you want to, you can join our bonus program on Spotify and iTunes. And I think that's it. Please tell your pets we said hi, hug them, cuddle them, treat them always kindly, even if they're tippy-toeing behind you. And
I can hear his tippy toes.
Be kind to your fellow human beings and be kind to yourself.
Absolutely. And just remember, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.